guess I will close out. I have a draft paper that needs lots of tough love. Not done with it. I'm sure of that. I got some comments today from Will Toby that were very helpful, and I'm sure as I think more about it, there'll be changes. But I thought it would be useful to kind of take a clever look. I'm all for cleverness, actually. At how different things might be now, looking forward for the next 20 years. I think up until now, we kind of have dealt with arms control much like the last several decades, maybe from the 50s or 60s to the 80s or 90s, that it's all familiar, incremental, and we'll be fine. We just kind of follow certain things we've done, complete work that we haven't, add some topics, gets things up on the wall as far as treaties or agreements. Fine. I think that might be wrong listening to everybody here. And if it is, maybe it's more like trying to think about the way in which we thought about arms control in the 20s and 30s versus the 40s and 50s, where this thing called nuclear energy and intercontinental missiles and long range bombers came onto the scene. And a lot of other things went away, like horse cavalry, battleships. I mean, a lot of things changed. If it's more like the latter, let me spotlight some scintillating areas for clever reflection that I might not be able to supply. One, let's talk about space. I think everyone presenting so far said you need to have a good footing in space because it's kind of the eyes, ears, voice, and nervous system of the military and even commercial world on the surface of the Earth. And so we need to somehow do well up there. Well, yeah, I think if to the extent that that's true, and I think it is true, then deterrence may be gravitating away from the surface of the Earth into space. Now, I don't exactly know what that means, but it does suggest we got a problem. The United States relies more on these systems than anyone else because we continue to insist on projecting force globally, and we have commercial interests apparently everywhere still, in a way that still the other competitors don't quite yet. And there's going to be a gap where we have legacy large, pretty vulnerable space systems, both in low Earth orbit and in geo and semi-geo, where you really might need not only to begin to spend to come up with new systems that are less vulnerable, and that will take time, maybe a decade. And during that decade, you'd want to have agreement with your allies, at least, to isolate or otherwise convince China and Russia to fall in line as well, with rules, not so much just of the road per se, but rules that, if violated, trigger rights to self-defense. And when I say rights to self-defense, I'm not saying, oh, well, you just blow things up. You'd have to measure this, but it might mean pushing things away physically in space so that certain distances were, obeyed. It might actually, in the case of ground-based jammers and lasers, which have, at least in the case of the lasers, a dual use. It may mean, if you break certain rules and are interfering, you might get targeted or blocked in some fashion. So that whole arena strikes me as a space competition. There may be a rendezvous of space diplomacy that registers in this point about when and how and to what extent one has rights to self-defense, given rendezvous satellites, the jammers, the lasers, which can really cause a lot of havoc, least for the next decade, before we figure out how to go to some different system. I think also you're going to see dual use space systems, using commercial systems for military purposes, and the whole role of insurance and rules and for liability and damage there being a factor in creating markets amongst friends and excluding adversaries who don't want to buy into those rules. Ultimately, I think there's another thing to start thinking about, and that is, to what extent is our reliance on space-based systems necessary, likely to grow, or are there alternatives? I'll give you an example. I don't know how far to take it. The Israelis apparently have developed drones that navigate dead reckoning based on artificial intelligence looking at the ground and doing recognition. And surely one could imagine it's not possible to have cars that drive unless they use dead reckoning based on mapping systems of streets. So there's a lot to play with as we get into an artificially intelligent world that may not require reliance on sensors in space. And so that whole dynamic over the next 20 years is one that's going to probably pace and if you will, shape whatever, not only competition, but whatever diplomacy we have. The next area like this would be, with more missiles, I think you may see a renaissance in missile defense cooperation. And here, it doesn't really matter as much as to how effective the missile defense is. The cooperation may thrive independent of that to some extent. But there are new technologies. I'm watching the drones being addressed by high-powered microwaves. I don't know to what extent that can deal with fast-flying ballistic and hypersonic and other categories of missiles, but my hunch is maybe on the margins there too. And people talk bravely about what lasers may be able to do in the future. I don't know, liquid lasers perhaps. Passive defenses, I think, have been unexamined. There are, ultra high performance concrete is getting cheaper and cheaper. Do you apply that? How does that work with decoys, everything else, mobility? This then also will shape the reinvention of a kind of London supplier group approach to the MTCR. It may be that you can work with folks in missile defense cooperatives to be more attentive to export controls of the problem. I don't know. You may want to think about the connection between those two. I think here you then slip into the question of, with the missiles, there's going to be a renaissance also in deterrence and targeting strategy. Are we really going to have deterrence based on taking cities out? I mean, that's roughly what the unspoken truth has been since 1942. Okay, with the attacking of area attacking of cities in Europe and then in Asia, and then using nuclear weapons to do the same job and then threatening to do this. I don't know how sustainable that is. When you have precise missiles, I think you're going to start looking at targeting the sort of the sinews of power, which may be not people, but things. And it could be that, with systems that are drones, there's a movie called Slaughterbots. I recommend it. It's quite sporty. Facial recognition. You get 1,500 faces you really want to knock out, and they constitute the elite of a country. And you just unleash them in the capital, and they go find their prey. You could kill a nation in a way that doesn't kill large numbers of people. So this might get us more interested in putting agreements on, not using nuclear weapons. It was mentioned not using them on certain missiles. Maybe you have a sentimental, but I think important position on not targeting cities with nukes. maybe you start limiting fissile material, whether it's civilian or not. Maybe you put an emphasis on not withdrawing from the NPT, and you strengthen the NPT, which supposedly is dead or about to die. Well, maybe you take a look at that again. I think the worry next, however, is the slaughter bots. I have to say, I don't know how you control artificial intelligence. I don't know how you control 5G. I don't know how you deal with that threat other than something that's so big, I hesitate to raise it, and that is, if your form of government and your civics and your faith in your civics is strong, it might be harder to kill a nation just by going after some elites. We may have to resort to protections of a very basic kind, if that's correct. But all of these things are things in the next 10 to 20 years that might come into play. And so I thought I'd excite everyone's humors to see if anyone can be clever about this. I think China and Russia will have problems with these things as well. And, while they have certain advantages, they are going to have vulnerabilities too on these fronts. And I think it's a mistake to think, they hold all the cards. Maybe we'll just leave it at that.